If you enjoyed this interesting video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring you even more exciting and thought-provoking content. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads. Join our growing community today. Your feedback, comments, and ideas truly keep this channel alive.
Chapter 1: The Birth of a Fighter. The story of Kassa Hailu, later crowned Emperor Tewodros II of Ethiopia, begins in the rugged highlands of Quora in 1818. At the time, Ethiopia was not a unified empire. Instead, it was trapped in a chaotic period that historians call the Zemin Mesafint, the era of the princes. Local warlords and powerful nobles divided the land, each ruling their own territory like miniature kingdoms. The emperor in Gondar still carried the title of King of Kings, but in truth he was a figurehead. Real power belonged to regional leaders who often fought each other, making the country unstable and vulnerable. Kassa was born into this fractured world without the advantages that noble blood usually offered. His family was not wealthy, nor did they have strong political influence. His father, Hailu, died when Kassa was still a boy. His mother, Wazero Atidajeb, raised him with resilience, teaching him to endure hardship and never bow to defeat. Growing up in the harsh Ethiopian countryside, Kassa learned early that survival demanded strength, courage, and sharp intelligence. As a young man, he witnessed how ordinary people suffered under the rule of rival warlords. Armies looted villages, crops were stolen, and peasants were forced to pay crushing taxes. Kassa carried these memories with him, fueling his anger at injustice. Unlike many who accepted the chaos of the era, he dreamed of change. He wanted to see a united Ethiopia, where the emperor's crown once again commanded respect and where the people could live without fear of endless war. But dreams were not enough. To rise in a world controlled by swords and power, Kassa needed to fight. His reputation as a warrior began to grow during his early campaigns in Quora. He was quick on the battlefield, known for his ability to lead small groups of fighters with brilliant tactics. Where larger armies failed, Kassa succeeded by striking fast and adapting to the terrain. He gained the loyalty of men who saw him not as an aristocrat commanding from a palace, but as one of their own. Stories of his bravery spread quickly. People whispered about the young leader who charged at the front of his men, sword in hand, unafraid of death. He was not the kind of commander who hid behind walls. He fought, bled, and suffered alongside his soldiers. In return, his fighters followed him with fierce devotion. Kassa also showed a gift for strategy beyond the battlefield. He knew how to inspire loyalty through fairness and discipline. When he captured land, he did not allow his men to plunder helpless villagers. Instead, he demanded order, a rare quality among warlords of the time. Peasants who had once feared armies began to welcome his presence, seeing him as a protector rather than a destroyer. Slowly, his name became associated with justice as well as strength. By his late 20s, Kassa Hailu was no longer just another fighter in Ethiopia's endless wars. He was a rising force, and rival nobles began to take notice. They recognized that this ambitious young man could upset the fragile balance of power. Some tried to recruit him as an ally, offering him land or titles. But Kassa was not content to serve under any lord. He carried a vision far greater than the ambitions of local chiefs. He believed he was destined to end the chaos of the Zemin Mesafint and restore the dignity of the Ethiopian crown. It was during this time that prophecies circulated through the land. Old monks and storytellers spoke of a ruler who would rise, bearing the name Tewodros, who would reunite Ethiopia and make her strong again. Kassa listened to these words with intensity. Though he had not yet claimed the throne, he began to feel the weight of destiny pressing upon him. His early victories, however, also brought enemies. The established warlords of Ethiopia did not welcome his rise. They viewed him as a dangerous upstart, a man from humble beginnings who dared to challenge nobles who traced their bloodlines to ancient dynasties. For Kassa, every victory meant more powerful foes ahead. Yet this did not stop him. If anything, it made him bolder. The young warrior began to sharpen not only his sword but also his vision of leadership. He imagined an army that was not just a collection of men but a disciplined force capable of defeating much larger enemies. He studied foreign weapons, showing a fascination for cannons and rifles, tools of war that could shift the balance of power. He did not yet have the means to acquire them, but the seeds of modernization were already growing in his mind. As the 1840s turned into the 1850s, Ethiopia waited on the edge of change. The fractured land, bleeding from years of division, needed a unifier. In the highlands of Quora, a young man named Kassa Hailu was preparing himself for that role. He was not yet emperor, not yet the figure history would call Tewodros II, but the path had already begun. His rise would not be easy. The battles ahead would test not only his strength but also his dreams. But for now, Ethiopia had found in Kassa something it had not seen in years. A leader who believed in a destiny larger than himself, a fighter born from the people, and a man determined to command history rather than be crushed by it. Chapter 2: The Warrior of Quora. By the early 1840s, Kassa Hailu had become more than a local fighter. He was transforming into a leader who commanded loyalty beyond his birthplace. The rugged landscapes of Quora shaped him into a soldier who understood terrain, movement, and the value of discipline. Unlike other warlords who relied on sheer numbers and brutal force, Kassa used strategy. His forces were smaller, but under his command they fought with precision and coordination. This discipline made them unpredictable and dangerous. At the heart of his leadership was his ability to connect with his men. Kassa did not keep himself above them. He marched when they marched, slept on the ground when they slept, and ate the same simple meals. In battle, he stood at the front lines, sword raised, shouting commands with a voice that cut through the chaos. His men fought with the knowledge that their commander would never ask them to risk anything he would not risk himself. That kind of leadership built unbreakable trust. The people of Quora and neighboring regions began to see him as different from the oppressive lords who exploited them. Farmers who once feared soldiers now offered Kassa food and shelter, sometimes even their sons to join his growing force. The more support he gained from ordinary people, the stronger his army became. He was not just a warrior anymore, he was becoming a symbol of hope. But Ethiopia in this period was still torn apart by rival rulers. The Yeju dynasty, who held real power through the office of regent known as the Ras, dominated northern Ethiopia. Other warlords like Dejazmik Haile Mariam of Tigray controlled large armies and saw themselves as future kings. For these men, Kassa was a problem. He was young, ambitious, and unwilling to play by their rules. One of the defining moments of Kassa's rise came in 1847 at the Battle of Kosobar. Outnumbered by the forces of a rival warlord, Kassa used cunning rather than brute force. He led his army into the highlands, using narrow mountain passes to trap his enemy's soldiers. When the battle came, his men fought like a coordinated unit rather than scattered fighters. The rival army collapsed, and Kassa's victory announced his arrival as a serious contender in Ethiopia's power struggles. These victories brought him not just fame but also enemies. Warlords began forming alliances to stop him. Some tried to lure him into their service, offering him titles and land. But Kassa was not interested in being anyone's general. His vision was greater. He wanted to restore the crown and end the constant wars. He wanted to unify Ethiopia under a single emperor, not be remembered as just another regional commander. Despite his growing influence, Kassa lived simply. He wore the traditional white shama of the Ethiopian highlands, and rode with little display of wealth. What he carried instead was a fierce determination and the belief that destiny was on his side. The prophecy of a ruler named Tewodros weighed heavily on his mind. In church sermons and among monks, whispers spread that Kassa might be the one foretold. These whispers gave his cause a sense of divine mission. In the 1850s, Kassa faced one of his greatest challenges when he confronted Dejazmik Zaude at the Battle of Gramba. Gashu was a respected noble with a strong army, and many believed Kassa had finally overreached. But once again, Kassa's discipline and tactical genius turned the tide. His army crushed Gashu's forces, and the victory shocked the nobility of Ethiopia. Kassa was no longer just a rising fighter, he was a national power. After Gramba, the path to the throne was clear. Still, the journey was not finished. Kassa had to deal with rivals like Haile Mariam and Ras Ali II, who clung to the old order of divided rule. Each victory brought him closer to fulfilling his vision, but also deeper into a dangerous game of politics and war. What made Kassa unique was his refusal to act like the other warlords. Where they sought personal gain, he carried himself as if he were already the guardian of Ethiopia's future. His victories were not only military but also symbolic. To many Ethiopians, he represented justice, discipline, and the promise of unity. The young commander who had once been dismissed as a peasant-born fighter was now a force none could ignore. His army moved like a storm across the highlands, defeating larger forces with speed and intelligence. The banner of Kassa Hailu struck fear into rival nobles and gave hope to peasants who dreamed of peace. By the mid-1850s, Ethiopia was waiting for change. The people were tired of endless wars and shifting alliances. They needed a strong hand to restore the dignity of the Solomonic crown. And in the mountains of Quora, Kassa Hailu, the warrior of Quora, was preparing to take the next step, one that would transform him from commander to emperor, from fighter to legend. Chapter 3: The Crown of Tewodros. By the mid-1850s, Ethiopia was a nation exhausted by endless rivalry. Powerful nobles carved out territories, each calling themselves guardians of tradition, yet none able to bring true stability. The country longed for a leader who could unify its scattered lands. Into this moment stepped Kassa Hailu, the warrior of Quora, whose victories had already shaken the nobility. His name carried both admiration and fear, and now his path led directly to the throne. The turning point came after the Battle of Tewodros in 1855. Kassa faced the forces of Ras Ali II, the regent of the Yejud dynasty who still held influence over the imperial court. Ras Ali commanded a large army, but his soldiers lacked discipline. Kassa's men, hardened by years of battle and trained under his strict leadership, fought with precision. The battle was fierce, with swords clashing and war cries echoing across the highlands, but in the end Ras Ali's forces broke and fled. The victory at Tewodros was more than just a military success. It cleared the way for Kassa to claim the imperial title. On February 11, 1855, he was formally crowned Emperor of Ethiopia, taking the throne named Tewodros II. In that moment, the prophecy seemed fulfilled. The long-awaited ruler named Tewodros had arrived to restore unity and power to the empire. The coronation was both political and deeply symbolic. Tewodros did not inherit the crown through noble lineage. He seized it by force of will, vision, and strength. To the common people, this made him even more remarkable. He was not another aristocrat born into privilege. He was one of their own, a man who had risen from hardship to the highest throne in the land. As emperor, Tewodros II carried bold ambitions. He envisioned a united Ethiopia where the power of local warlords would be broken and where the emperor's authority would be absolute. He wanted to end the Zenin Mesafint, the era of the princes, once and for all. His goal was not only to unify the country but also to modernize it. He dreamed of building roads, reforming administration, and creating an army strong enough to defend Ethiopia from foreign threats. Tewodros understood that to achieve these goals he needed discipline and centralization. He began dismantling the power of regional nobles, confiscating land and forcing loyalty to the crown. He also sought to reduce the influence of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which had long acted as a political power of its own. These moves brought him enemies, but Tewodros was determined to weaken every rival who could challenge his vision. On the battlefield, he continued to lead with the same fearlessness that had defined him as Kassa Hailu. His presence inspired soldiers, and his name struck fear into enemies. In one battle, witnesses recalled how he charged at the head of his cavalry, sword flashing in the sunlight, shouting commands as his men surged forward. To his army, he was not just a king but a warrior king, fighting alongside them with unmatched courage. At the same time, he began to pursue modernization. Fascinated by technology, Tewodros dreamed of creating Ethiopia's own cannon foundries and weapons workshops. He invited European artisans to his court, and even attempted to build his own artillery with local craftsmen. Though resources were limited, his determination showed a mind that looked beyond tradition. He wanted Ethiopia to be strong not just through numbers but through innovation. Yet his bold reforms also stirred resistance. Nobles resented losing their autonomy, and church leaders resisted his attempts to curb their influence. Even among his allies, whispers spread that the emperor was too harsh, too uncompromising. Tewodros believed discipline was necessary to achieve unity, but to those who opposed him, it felt like tyranny. Despite these tensions, many Ethiopians admired his resolve. For the first time in generations, the empire had a ruler who seemed determined to restore dignity and strength. Peasants who had suffered under feudal warlords saw in Tewodros a chance for peace. Soldiers who followed him believed they were building something greater than themselves. His rule was not just about holding power, it was about forging a new Ethiopia. Still, the challenges ahead were enormous. Ethiopia's size and diversity made unity difficult. Every noble he defeated left behind loyalists who dreamed of revenge. Foreign powers, particularly Britain, France, and Egypt, watched Ethiopia with interest, sometimes offering promises of friendship but often seeking influence. Tewodros's desire to modernize would bring him into direct contact, and eventually conflict, with Europe. For now, however, Emperor Tewodros II stood at the height of his power. He had risen from humble beginnings, fought countless battles, and claimed the Solomonic throne. He was a commander who led with his sword, a visionary who sought to reshape his nation, and a ruler determined to be remembered not as a warlord but as the unifier of Ethiopia. Chapter 4: Dreams of Unity and Power. When Kassa Hailu became Emperor Tewodros II in 1855, Ethiopia was both hopeful and restless. For generations, the crown had been weak, overshadowed by nobles and regents. Now, for the first time in many years, the emperor was a fighter, a visionary, and a man determined to restore authority. His coronation was not the end of his struggle, it was the beginning of a new and even greater challenge. Tewodros dreamed of a united, modern Ethiopia. He wanted to break the cycle of endless wars and bring order to a land divided by rival warlords. But to achieve this, he would need to transform not just the throne, but the very way Ethiopia was governed. His vision reached far beyond simply wearing the crown. The first step was to centralize power. Ethiopia had long been dominated by feudal lords who controlled vast territories and collected their own taxes. Tewodros moved quickly to dismantle this system. He confiscated lands from rebellious nobles and redistributed them under the crown. By reducing the independence of regional chiefs, he strengthened imperial authority. This decision made him enemies, but it also forced Ethiopia to look at the emperor as the true center of power once again. At the same time, Tewodros sought to curb the influence of the church. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church was deeply respected, but its leaders often interfered in politics. Tewodros respected faith, yet he believed no institution should rival the authority of the crown. He demanded that church leaders recognize imperial supremacy. Some clergy resisted, and in several cases he responded harshly, punishing those who opposed him. His actions shocked traditionalists, but Tewodros believed discipline was necessary for progress. Beyond politics, the emperor was fascinated by technology and innovation. Unlike many rulers of his era, he dreamed of modernization. He wanted Ethiopia to produce its own weapons and military equipment rather than depend on foreign traders. In his court, he began gathering artisans and craftsmen to experiment with making rifles, cannons, and even steam engines. He believed that only a modern army could secure Ethiopia against foreign powers. One famous project was his attempt to build a massive cannon, which he named Sebastopol after the Crimean War. The cannon was so large it required hundreds of men and animals to move. But its very creation showed his ambition. Tewodros wanted Ethiopia to stand proudly among nations, armed not just with courage but with modern firepower. In the capital, he also tried to improve administration. He ordered officials to reduce corruption, demanded fair tax collection, and punished governors who abused their people. These reforms made him popular among peasants, who had long been the victims of exploitation. Farmers began to see him as a protector, someone who understood their suffering and worked to improve their lives. But Tewodros was not always patient. His temper was fierce, and when he felt betrayed or disobeyed, he could be brutal. Stories spread of punishments so harsh that even loyal followers began to fear his anger. While his vision was noble, his methods often created resentment. Nobles who lost their land plotted revenge, and church leaders who felt humiliated spoke against him in whispers. Despite these tensions, his army remained loyal. Tewodros personally trained his soldiers, drilling them to fight in disciplined formations rather than the loose styles of the past. He introduced stricter codes of conduct and rewarded bravery with promotions. His men saw him as both a king and a comrade, a commander who shared their dangers. When battles came, he was always at the front, his sword raised high, leading the charge. His presence inspired courage, and his enemies often broke at the sight of him advancing through the smoke of war. Tewodros also began to look outward. He wanted Ethiopia to have allies among the European powers. He wrote letters to Queen Victoria of Britain, Napoleon III of France, and other rulers, asking for skilled workers, weapons, and support. He imagined building diplomatic ties that would bring Ethiopia both respect and resources. But these letters often went unanswered, and the silence would later play a tragic role in his downfall. For now, though, Tewodros stood firm as the strongest emperor Ethiopia had seen in generations. He was feared by nobles, admired by commoners, and respected by his soldiers. His dream was bold: to end the era of the princes, unify the empire, and lay the foundation for a modern Ethiopian state. Yet bold dreams often come with heavy costs. His reforms created enemies inside Ethiopia, and his frustration with foreign powers grew as he received no reply to his requests. The emperor who carried the hopes of a nation also carried the weight of loneliness, knowing that he stood almost alone against powerful forces both at home and abroad. Still, Emperor Tewodros II refused to yield. In his heart, he believed he had been chosen by destiny, perhaps even by God, to restore Ethiopia's greatness. He would not bow to warlords, nor to the church, nor even to foreign kings. His rule was only beginning, and his story was far from over. Chapter 5: Shadows of Resistance. By the late 1850s, Emperor Tewodros II had secured his throne through blood and fire. He had risen from the hills of Quora, defeated rivals on the battlefield, and taken the Solomonic crown with the confidence of destiny. His reign began with great energy, reforms, discipline, and dreams of modernization. Yet as his power grew, so too did resistance from those who felt threatened by his vision. The Ethiopian nobility, long accustomed to ruling their territories as near kings, bristled under his authority. Tewodros confiscated their lands, stripped them of independent power, and demanded loyalty to the imperial crown. Many bowed outwardly but seethed in secret. Among the clergy, resentment also grew. The emperor had challenged their influence, reminding them that the cross should not overshadow the crown. For centuries, nobles and church leaders had dictated politics. Now, under Tewodros, their influence was being dismantled brick by brick. Despite these enemies, Tewodros pressed forward with reforms. He envisioned Ethiopia as a strong, centralized state where justice was enforced fairly, and the emperor's word carried real power. He reorganized the military, training soldiers with stricter discipline than any Ethiopian army had known. He punished corruption, ensuring tax collectors could no longer steal from peasants without consequence. For ordinary farmers and villagers, these changes felt like a breath of fresh air. For the ruling elite, they felt like chains. Tewodros's temper became infamous during this period. He demanded loyalty not just in action but in spirit. If he suspected betrayal, his anger could erupt like a storm. Punishments were severe, sometimes shocking even to his closest followers. Those who crossed him might lose land, freedom, or life. While this made rebellion dangerous, it also spread fear throughout the empire. His dream of unity was clear, but the methods he used often turned potential allies into enemies. At the same time, his fascination with modernization deepened. He longed to transform Ethiopia's military into a force that could rival European armies. Cannons, rifles, and modern artillery fascinated him. He gathered blacksmiths, artisans, and even prisoners skilled in crafts, ordering them to experiment with new weapons. His most famous creation, the massive cannon Sebastopol, symbolized both his ambition and his stubborn willpower. Though the cannon was unwieldy and nearly impossible to move, it showed Ethiopia that their emperor was determined to innovate, even against overwhelming odds. But modernization required more than ambition. It required skilled workers, materials, and technology that Ethiopia lacked. Tewodros turned to Europe, hoping to build alliances that would support his vision. He wrote letters to Queen Victoria of Britain, to Napoleon III of France, and to other rulers, requesting weapons, artisans, and advisors. These letters were not mere diplomatic courtesies, they were heartfelt appeals from a leader determined to lift his nation into the modern age. Yet the responses never came. His envoys were ignored, and his pleas sat unanswered in European courts. For a man of Tewodros's pride, this silence felt like an insult. He believed he was the equal of any monarch in the world, chosen by destiny to rule Ethiopia. To be dismissed, ignored, and treated as insignificant wounded him deeply. What had begun as hope for friendship with Europe slowly turned into resentment. Meanwhile, rebellion stirred inside the empire. Nobles who had lost their power began plotting, waiting for the moment to strike back. Some rallied soldiers to their cause, others whispered to foreign traders, hoping to gain weapons and support from outside Ethiopia. Tewodros crushed several uprisings with his usual ferocity. His army marched relentlessly, burning out pockets of resistance and punishing disloyal chiefs. His victories were impressive, but each one left scars. The more he punished, the more enemies he created. Still, his soldiers adored him. To them, Tewodros was not just a king but a warrior king, a man who fought at their side and shared their dangers. In battle, he was fearless, leading charges with sword drawn, shouting commands above the roar of musket fire. He inspired men who would follow him into impossible fights, trusting his courage more than their own. His bond with the army became the backbone of his rule. For the Ethiopian people, his reign was a paradox. They admired his strength and his dream of unity. Many peasants welcomed his justice and protection from abusive lords. But they also feared his wrath, which could be as unforgiving as the highland storms. He was a man of vision and fire, and his fire sometimes burned too hot. By 1860, Tewodros II stood at a crossroads. He had rebuilt the dignity of the Ethiopian crown, crushed rivals, and restored authority to the empire. Yet isolation weighed heavily on him. The nobles despised his control, the clergy questioned his reforms, and Europe had dismissed his appeals. He had the loyalty of his soldiers, but an emperor needed more than swords to secure lasting power. The shadows of resistance were lengthening. And though he could not yet see it, the silence of Europe would soon bring a storm that even his courage might not withstand. Chapter 6: Letters to the World. By the early 1860s, Emperor Tewodros II had carved his name into Ethiopia's history. He had defeated his rivals, restored the dignity of the Solomonic throne, and forced the empire to acknowledge the emperor's authority once more. Yet for all his victories, he felt the weight of isolation pressing heavily upon him. Tewodros had always believed that Ethiopia must look outward as well as inward. His vision was not only to unite his own people but also to connect his empire to the wider world. In his mind, alliances with European powers could bring weapons, craftsmen, and knowledge that would accelerate Ethiopia's modernization. He dreamed of railways through the highlands, factories that produced rifles, and schools where children learned not only scripture but also science. To achieve this, he wrote letters, dozens of them. His scribes prepared messages to the courts of Britain, France, and Russia, each carefully worded with respect yet filled with urgency. In 1862, he sent one of his most famous letters to Queen Victoria of Britain, asking for skilled workers, guns, and technical advisors. He spoke as a fellow sovereign, believing that one monarch would surely recognize the dignity of another. But in Europe, his letters were set aside, lost in the bureaucratic shuffle of colonial offices. British officials saw Ethiopia as distant, its emperor as an unfamiliar figure whose requests seemed more bothersome than important. For Tewodros, the silence was unbearable. He had extended his hand in friendship, only to be ignored. To a man of his pride and vision, this felt like a direct insult. Not just to himself, but to the empire he ruled. Frustration soon turned into anger. He began to suspect that Europeans looked down on Ethiopia, dismissing it as a backward land. His dream of partnership soured into resentment. In his mind, Britain had humiliated him, and such humiliation demanded a response. The breaking point came when he turned his anger against foreign residents in Ethiopia. Missionaries and envoys, once welcomed at his court, found themselves caught in the storm of his temper. In 1864, Tewodros imprisoned several British officials and missionaries, including Captain Charles Cameron, the British consul. He believed that by holding them, he could force Britain to respond, to finally recognize him and take his requests seriously. The decision was bold but dangerous. What Tewodros saw as a bargaining tool, Britain saw as an act of defiance. The imprisonment of their citizens outraged London, where officials began planning a military response. For the first time, the distant empire of Ethiopia was about to collide directly with the power of the British Empire. Inside Ethiopia, cracks in Tewodros's rule widened. His harsh punishments and uncompromising nature alienated nobles who might otherwise have supported him. Some chiefs began to rebel again, taking advantage of his growing isolation. Even within his inner circle, whispers of doubt spread. The emperor who had once been hailed as a savior was now feared as much as he was admired. Yet Tewodros himself never doubted his destiny. To his soldiers, he remained the fearless warrior king who led them into battle. He spoke of defending Ethiopia not only against internal rivals but against foreign arrogance. His pride was wounded, but his spirit burned brighter than ever. He saw himself as the defender of Ethiopia's honor, a man who would rather die fighting than bow to an insult. At his fortress of Magdala, perched high in the mountains, Tewodros prepared for what he believed was coming. He strengthened his defenses, stockpiled weapons, and ordered his artisans to produce more arms. The great cannon Sebastopol was dragged to the fortress, symbolizing both his determination and his defiance. If Britain dared to march into Ethiopia, he would meet them with fire and steel. But while he prepared for war, his empire weakened. Rebellions simmered, and loyalties wavered. The emperor's energy, once focused on uniting the country, was now consumed by his anger at Europe. His vision of a modern Ethiopia still flickered, but it was overshadowed by the coming confrontation. In London, the decision was made. A military expedition would march into Ethiopia to free the prisoners and humble the emperor who had dared to defy Britain. Led by General Robert Napier, one of the finest commanders of the age, the British prepared an invasion force armed with modern rifles, artillery, and engineers. For Ethiopia, the stage was set for one of the most dramatic clashes in its history. For Tewodros II, it was the beginning of the final chapter of his reign, a test not only of his courage, but of the very dream he had carried since his youth. Would Ethiopia bow to foreign power, or would its emperor stand defiant, even against impossible odds? At Magdala, the warrior king sharpened his sword and waited. Chapter 7: The March of the British. In 1867, word spread through Ethiopia that a foreign army was coming. Not a caravan of traders, nor a band of missionaries, but the full weight of the British Empire. Emperor Tewodros II had believed that by holding foreign prisoners, he could force Britain to recognize his authority. Instead, he had provoked an expedition unlike anything the Highlands had ever seen. The British plan was ambitious. They assembled an army of more than 13,000 soldiers, accompanied by thousands of Indian troops, engineers, and laborers. It was not just an invasion force but a moving city. Camels, Elephants and mules carried supplies through the deserts and mountains. Engineers built roads and bridges as the army advanced, ensuring that artillery and heavy weapons could cross even the roughest terrain. This was the industrial power of the West on full display, and its destination was the heart of Ethiopia. The expedition was commanded by General Robert Napier, a man known for discipline and caution. He understood the dangers of Ethiopia's landscape: towering mountains, deep valleys, and fierce warriors who knew every pass and gorge. Napier advanced carefully, building alliances with local chiefs along the way. Many Ethiopian leaders, weary of Tewodros' harsh rule, saw the British as a useful force to weaken the emperor. They offered guides, supplies, and sometimes even troops to the foreign army. For Tewodros, this was a bitter betrayal. The very nobles he had tried to unify under the crown were now siding with outsiders. To him, they were cowards willing to sell Ethiopia's honor for temporary advantage. Still, he held firm at his mountain fortress of Magdala, determined that if the British came, they would find him ready. The march of the British army was itself a spectacle. Ethiopian villagers watched in awe as columns of red-coated soldiers moved with precision, their rifles gleaming in the sun. Cannons rumbled forward, pulled by teams of animals, while Indian sappers built camps and fortifications each night. The discipline of the foreign soldiers was unlike anything many Ethiopians had ever seen. At the same time, the sheer scale of the invasion unsettled even Tewodros' most loyal followers. Rumors spread of the British carrying weapons that could shatter walls and kill at great distances. Stories of giant cannons and unending supplies of ammunition filled the highlands. Some whispered that the army was unstoppable, that even the strongest fortress would fall before its might. But Tewodros refused to show fear. From the walls of Magdala, he rallied his men. He reminded them of Ethiopia's long history of independence, of kings and warriors who had resisted invaders for centuries. He declared that Magdala was not just a fortress but a holy place, a last line of defense for their faith and their land. He urged them to fight not only for their emperor but for the honor of Ethiopia itself. As the British drew closer, skirmishes broke out along the routes leading into the highlands. Ethiopian warriors ambushed supply lines, using the terrain to their advantage. For a time, it seemed possible that the mountains themselves might wear down the invaders. But Napier's discipline and careful planning prevented disaster. His troops pushed forward, step by step, overcoming every obstacle. By early 1868, the British army was within striking distance of Magdala. The fortress loomed high on its plateau, surrounded by sheer cliffs and narrow paths. To any who saw it for the first time, it looked nearly impregnable. This was Tewodros' strength. His enemies would have to climb to reach him, and in those narrow approaches, he believed his warriors could break even the most modern army. Inside the fortress, however, tension grew. Supplies were strained, and some of Tewodros' allies had deserted. His once vast following was now reduced to a smaller circle of loyal soldiers, craftsmen, and family members. Yet even in this moment of crisis, his pride remained unshaken. He ordered the great cannon Sebastopol to be positioned, its massive barrel aimed at the valleys below. He declared that if the British dared to advance, they would be met with fire unlike anything they had ever seen. From his vantage point, Tewodros could see the smoke of British camps rising in the distance. The invaders were coming, their march relentless, their power undeniable. But for him, there was no thought of surrender. He had been born Kassa Hailu, the orphan who fought his way through civil war to claim the crown. He had broken the feudal lords, crushed his enemies, and restored the dignity of the throne. Now, if his reign was to end, it would end on his own terms, with sword in hand, standing defiant against the mightiest empire of the age. And so, as the drums of the British army echoed across the valleys, Emperor Tewodros prepared his last defense. Magdala would be the stage for a battle that would echo through history, a clash not just of armies, but of worlds. Chapter 8: The Battle of Magdala. The morning of April 10, 1868, dawned over the Ethiopian highlands with a tense stillness. The British army, disciplined and organized, began its final advance toward Magdala. General Robert Napier had prepared carefully for this day. His soldiers had marched hundreds of miles through some of the most rugged terrain on earth. Now they faced the towering cliffs of Emperor Tewodros II's fortress. Magdala was no ordinary stronghold. Rising above the surrounding valleys, its sheer rock walls seemed to pierce the sky. The approach was narrow, winding through steep paths and sharp ridges. Any attacker would be vulnerable, exposed to defenders positioned above. Tewodros had chosen his ground wisely. Inside the fortress, Tewodros gathered his men. His once mighty army had dwindled to only a few thousand warriors, most of them loyal to the end. Supplies were low, morale was fragile, but their emperor's defiance burned brightly. He stood before them in full warrior dress, sword gleaming at his side, eyes filled with fire. "My brothers," he declared, voice echoing through the stone walls, "we stand not just for Magdala, but for Ethiopia. These foreigners come with their machines, their cannons, their endless supplies. They think we will kneel. But we are sons of the highlands. We are children of kings. Let the mountains witness our courage today." The men cheered, raising their spears and muskets. Yet beneath their cries of loyalty lay the quiet fear of what was to come. They had heard of British artillery, of the precision of their rifles, and of the giant cannons they dragged across mountains. Still, they trusted their emperor and the strength of their fortress. The battle began with the crack of rifles. Ethiopian warriors rushed down the narrow approaches to harass the enemy, firing from behind rocks and then vanishing into gullies. For a time, the British advance slowed. But Napier's troops moved steadily, firing in disciplined volleys. Each line of red-coated soldiers covered the next, their rifles firing with deadly accuracy. Soon, the British artillery opened fire. Shells exploded against the cliffs, shaking the very ground. Smoke and dust filled the air as cannon after cannon roared. The great fortress trembled, but it did not fall. Tewodros ordered Sebastopol, his massive homemade cannon, to be fired. The weapon boomed, hurling a shot into the valley below, but its aim was poor. Built by untrained hands with limited tools, the cannon could not match the precision of British guns. Still, the emperor stood tall on the walls, urging his men to fight harder. He pointed with his sword toward the advancing columns, shouting for charges. Groups of Ethiopian warriors surged forward, some with shields and spears, others with old muskets. They fought bravely, but the British firepower was overwhelming. Each wave was cut down, their courage meeting a wall of bullets and bayonets. By afternoon, the battlefield was littered with bodies. The air was thick with smoke and the cries of the wounded. Yet Tewodros did not retreat. He paced the fortress walls, rallying survivors, refusing to admit defeat. His defiance inspired those who remained, but the truth was clear: Magdala's defenses were breaking. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Napier ordered a final assault. Engineers built ladders, soldiers prepared charges, and the lines advanced once more. The British were determined to finish the fight before nightfall. Ethiopian warriors clashed with them at the gates, swords against bayonets, shields against rifles. The fighting was brutal, hand to hand in the dust and blood. From the heights of the fortress, Tewodros watched the clash unfold. His warriors were giving everything, but the enemy pressed forward relentlessly. He knew then that Magdala would not hold. The might of the British Empire, with its discipline and technology, was too great. Still, surrender was not in his heart. He told his closest followers that he would never be taken alive. He would rather die as a free emperor than live as a prisoner in chains. His words spread quickly among the defenders, strengthening their resolve for one final stand. That evening the fortress still stood, but its defenders were broken. Fires burned across the plateau. The British tightened their lines, preparing to storm the final defenses the next morning. Napier was confident that victory was near. Inside Magdala, however, Emperor Tewodros prepared for his last act. He had fought for decades to unite Ethiopia, to make her strong, to resist the meddling of foreign powers. Now he faced the greatest empire of his age. And though defeat loomed, his spirit remained unbroken. The stage was set for the final chapter of his life, a decision that would seal his place in Ethiopian history forever. Chapter 9: The Emperor's Final Hour. The night after the Battle of Magdala was heavy with smoke and silence. Fires still burned across the plateau, their glow casting long shadows on the fortress walls. The cries of the wounded carried into the darkness, echoing like laments for the fallen. Inside the stronghold, Emperor Tewodros II walked alone, his mind restless, his spirit fierce. He had fought with all his strength, and so had his men. Yet he could not ignore the truth. The walls of Magdala had held, but barely. The British army, with its cannons and disciplined ranks, would return at dawn to finish what it had begun. His warriors were exhausted, their numbers reduced, their weapons no match for the enemy's firepower. Defeat was no longer a matter of chance. It was certain. Tewodros gathered his closest generals and advisors that night. They sat around a small fire in the courtyard, their faces etched with sorrow. One after another, they spoke of loyalty and sacrifice, urging the emperor to flee. Some suggested retreat into the mountains, where he could rebuild and fight again. Others proposed surrender, hoping the British might show mercy. But Tewodros shook his head. "I did not raise the banner of Ethiopia to see it lowered before foreigners," he said firmly. "I will not bow to them. I will not be paraded as a prisoner through their streets. My throne may fall, but my honor will remain." His words silenced the room. Every man present knew what he meant. Tewodros was preparing for death. Among the emperor's possessions was a gift, once given to him by the British themselves. Years earlier, Queen Victoria had sent him a richly decorated pistol as a token of friendship. Tewodros had treasured it, but now he looked upon it with different eyes. It would not serve as a keepsake of diplomacy, but as the instrument of his final choice. As midnight passed, Tewodros climbed to the highest point of Magdala. From there, he could see the flickering fires of the British encampment below. He stood tall against the wind, gazing out at the mountains he loved so deeply. They had been his cradle, his refuge, and his battleground. The land had made him, and the land would witness his end. Memories flooded his mind, the struggles of his youth as Kassa Hailu, the victories that had made him emperor, the dream of a united Ethiopia. He remembered the cheers of his people when he marched in triumph, the letters he wrote to European kings, the bitter betrayals, the endless wars. His life had been one of struggle, but also of vision. He had tried to lift Ethiopia into greatness, to shield her from the greed of outsiders. Perhaps he had failed, but his efforts would not be forgotten. At dawn, the British prepared to storm the fortress. Their ladders were ready, their cannons positioned. General Napier had ordered a final assault, confident that Magdala would soon fall. Yet even as his troops advanced, a sudden stillness came over the defenders on the walls. A cry went up, spreading from man to man. "The Emperor is dead!" Tewodros had chosen his fate. Using the pistol gifted by Queen Victoria, he had ended his own life rather than be taken prisoner. He fell where he stood, his body draped in his warrior's cloak, his sword by his side. To his followers, it was a shocking but noble act, the last gesture of a man who would not surrender his freedom. When the British stormed the fortress, they found little resistance. The defenders, shaken by the loss of their emperor, laid down their arms. The battle was over. Magdala had fallen, but not by conquest alone. Tewodros's death had transformed defeat into defiance. General Napier himself approached the emperor's body. He looked upon Tewodros with respect, recognizing the courage in his final act. The emperor had fought with determination and had chosen death over humiliation. For Napier, it was clear, this was no ordinary foe, but a king who had defended his land with pride. The British buried Tewodros with military honors, acknowledging the dignity of a man who had stood against their empire. Yet they also looted Magdala, carrying away manuscripts, treasures, and sacred relics. The fortress that had been the heart of Tewodros's vision was left scarred and broken. For the Ethiopian people, his death was both a tragedy and a symbol. They mourned their emperor, but they also took pride in his refusal to surrender. He had shown the world that Ethiopia's spirit could not be broken, even in defeat. His story would echo through generations, inspiring future leaders to resist foreign domination. As the sun rose over the highlands, the smoke of battle faded, but the legacy of Tewodros II burned brightly. He had chosen his own ending, one that left no room for chains or humiliation. His life, marked by struggle and ambition, closed with a final act of freedom. And though Magdala fell, Ethiopia endured. Chapter 10: Legacy of a Warrior King. When the guns at Magdala fell silent and the smoke cleared, the British marched away with their spoils, but Ethiopia remained. The fortress was shattered, and its emperor lay buried, yet the spirit he had ignited was alive in the hearts of his people. Emperor Tewodros II, born Kassa Hailu, had passed from life into legend. His death marked the end of a turbulent reign, but his story was only beginning. In the months after his passing, Ethiopia mourned deeply. Songs were sung of the emperor who had risen from nothing, who had defeated powerful warlords, and who had dared to dream of a united land. Farmers whispered his name as they worked the soil, elders told children of his victories and his fiery will, and soldiers carried memories of his courage into future battles. Tewodros was no longer just a man. He had become a symbol of Ethiopia's pride and defiance. The British, though victorious, spoke of him with respect. General Napier, who had led the campaign, described him as brave, intelligent, and unyielding. Even his enemies could not deny the strength of his character. They had seen firsthand how he rallied his people and refused to bow to foreign rule. Though they carried away treasures from Magdala, they left behind a deeper inheritance, the story of a king who chose death over submission. Historians often debate Tewodros' legacy. Some point to his harsh rule, his ruthless campaigns against rivals, and his troubled diplomacy with Europe. They note the mistakes that weakened his throne and brought foreign armies to his gates. But others argue that his flaws were born from the weight he carried. He was not just fighting for a crown, but for Ethiopia's survival in a world increasingly dominated by imperial powers. What stands clear is that Tewodros dreamed of unity. At a time when Ethiopia was fractured by rival kingdoms and regional lords, he envisioned a single, strong nation. He saw the dangers of foreign interference, and understood that only a united Ethiopia could stand against it. Though his methods were sometimes brutal, his vision planted seeds that later rulers would nurture. After Tewodros, Ethiopia would face new challenges. Menelik II, another great emperor, would rise to carry forward the struggle for independence. At the Battle of Adwa in 1896, Ethiopians would achieve a stunning victory against Italy, ensuring that Ethiopia remained free while much of Africa fell under colonial rule. That triumph owed something to Tewodros. His resistance at Magdala, though ending in his death, had shown Ethiopians the cost and honor of defending their land. He proved that an emperor must be willing to fight and, if necessary, sacrifice everything for sovereignty. Beyond politics and war, Tewodros' story touches on the universal human struggle for dignity. He was a man of contradictions, visionary and ruthless, unifier and destroyer, a ruler who sought friendship with Europe yet distrusted its motives. In the end, he stood alone, choosing death rather than humiliation. That choice, more than any battle, defined his legacy. It made him a hero in the eyes of his people and a figure of fascination for the world. Today, Ethiopians honor Tewodros as one of the great defenders of their nation. Statues of him stand in towns and cities, his name is taught in schools, and his story is told in songs, books, and films. He is remembered not just as a king, but as a man who believed fiercely in Ethiopia's destiny. His fortress at Magdala, though scarred, remains a place of memory and reverence. Visitors stand on its heights and imagine the final moments of a leader who faced the world with defiance. In the broader history of Africa, Tewodros II stands alongside other leaders who resisted colonial domination. While many kingdoms fell quickly to European powers, Ethiopia endured. That endurance was shaped by rulers like Tewodros, who refused to yield. His life reminds us that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the determination of one leader can inspire generations. As the sun sets over the Ethiopian highlands, the land he loved still carries his spirit. The mountains that bore witness to his rise and fall echo with his story. The rivers and valleys he fought to defend remain part of a free nation, one of the few in Africa never colonized.